Hey, 42 here. According to Benjamin Franklin, nothing in this world is certain, except death, taxes, and the irrepressible advance of human technology. Okay, so I made that last one up, but you have to admit, it's hard to argue. Year after year, the phone in your pocket is pumped with pixels and sharper cameras. Your laptop gets a faster processor and more memory. Your car gets safer and more efficient. And yet another FIFA game is released. That's an absolute minimum 1% better than its predecessor. Then again, perhaps there's a good reason Mr. Franklin chose not to include my addendum with his famous quote, aside from the fact that he died 232 years before I suggested it, because it turns out that technology hasn't always progressed so predictably. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. Play more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships in dynamic combined arms PvP battles. I really admire the incredible detail of each vehicle, which really increases the immersion. You can play now on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, or the previous gen of consoles. War Thunder features a huge collection of vehicles that span over 100 years of development, from 1920 to the present day. There's an in-depth customization system so you can camouflage your vehicle and add historical markings. The graphics are incredible, with detailed 4K resolution, authentic sound effects, and beautiful music, creating an atmosphere you can fully immerse yourself in. But my absolute favourite part of War Thunder is the damage system, which is the most dynamic and detailed I've ever seen. There are no general hit points. Instead, vehicles suffer actual damage to their components and crew. A damage X-ray shows exactly what happens to you or your enemy's vehicles as it's damaged or destroyed. Play War Thunder now on PC, PlayStation or Xbox using my link in the description. By clicking my unique link and registering, you'll get a large free bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles, premium account, boosters and much more. And thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Take a look at these two pictures. One of these aeroplanes is a cutting-edge machine introduced to the market in 2018. The other was designed in the 50s and made its maiden flight in 1969, 4 months before Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Okay, so there's a fair chance you know which is which here. Concorde is arguably the most iconic aircraft ever built. But just pretend you didn't for a second. If you'd never seen these two planes before, which one would you think was half a century newer? I know which I'd go for. There's something undeniably futuristic about Concorde's alpha wings and sharply pointed nose. But the differences are more than just hull deep. The Airbus A330neo has a maximum speed of 570 miles per hour and a cruising altitude of 41,450 feet. Concorde, on the other hand, this ancient relic that predates the personal computer, flew 50% higher and more than twice as fast. If you were to hop on a plane from London to New York today, the trip would take you around 8 hours. Concorde could do it in under 3. This is a plane that flew so high its passengers could see the curvature of the Earth, and so fast it tore through the air quicker than a 9mm bullet fired from a handgun. So just what the hell's going on here? How could a 60-year-old plane possibly surpass a much more advanced one that's only a few years old? And why did Concorde ultimately get mothballed? Why, 60 years on, can I not fly a commercial craft as fast as the mighty Concorde? If you're already familiar with this story, you might think you know why Concorde failed, because of safety concerns following the high-profile crash of Air France Flight 4590 in the year 2000. But it turns out that's a common misconception. Prior to that infamous incident, Concorde was arguably the safest plane in the entire world, without a single fatal accident in its entire 30 years of service. So, if safety wasn't the issue, what was? The short answer to that question is the sticky science of air resistance, sonic booms, Osama bin Laden, and the internet. As for the long answer, well, I'll see what I can do. Right from its inception, the development of Concorde was a colossal pain in the arse. A joint venture between France and Britain, it was supposed to be an airborne technological statement that would be the envy of the world. But creating a commercial aeroplane capable of cruising at twice the speed of sound turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. A plethora of technical hurdles stood in the way, and some impressive engineering was required to leap over them, including the development of Concorde's distinctive droop nose to improve pilot visibility during landing, the creation of the first carbon-based brakes ever used in an aircraft to help handle high landing speeds, and numerous structural innovations designed to cope with the extreme forces that pass through the plane's frame when maneuvering at high speed. Then there was the fact that Concorde flew so fast its outer surface heated up considerably during flight, through friction with the surrounding air. Despite cruising at 60,000 feet where typical temperatures are minus 55 degrees Celsius, when Concorde landed, it was still warm to the touch. Innovative solutions were developed to cool the plane inside and out, including the use of onboard fuel as a heat sink. All told, thousands of different challenges had to be overcome to get Concorde off the ground, and the technical wizardry required to do so cost a lot of money. By the time Concorde was finally fit to fly, it was one of the most over-budget projects of all time. Projected to cost £70 million, it ended up exceeding £2 billion. But even with all that money spent and all those technical problems abracadabraed out of existence, Concorde's issues were only just beginning. In the early days of the project, the public were incredibly excited about the prospect of this new, revolutionary form of air travel, but their excitement soon gave way to dismay when people finally saw, or should I say, heard Concorde for the first time. To this day, it remains one of the loudest commercial aeroplanes ever built. Its colossal cacophony came chiefly from its 4 Rolls-Royce afterburning turbojet engines, which were loud enough to rattle windows and set off car alarms near runways. That certainly sucked if you lived near a major airport, but it was the other instrument in Concorde's infernal orchestra that really upset people: the infamous sonic boom. As you probably know, a sonic boom is produced when you hold backwards for 2 seconds, then tap forwards and punch. Sorry, wrong video. As you probably know, a sonic boom is produced when an object breaks a sound barrier. What you may not know is that the term itself is actually pretty misleading. A sonic boom isn't a single sound that only triggers once as the barrier is broken. It's a continuous noise created by a shockwave that persists so long as the plane exceeds the speed of sound. That might sound like semantics, but it's actually a really important distinction, because it means a sonic boom produced by Concorde, which could be loud enough to cause minor structural damage to buildings and even shatter glass, would be heard by every single person within 30 miles of its entire flight path. By the way, if you've ever noticed that sonic booms sound a lot like thunder, that's because that's exactly what thunder is. When lightning strikes, it rapidly heats the surrounding air, creating a shockwave that spreads faster than the speed of sound, which in turn creates a sonic boom. Anyway, when the general public first began to realise that having a bunch of Concordes flying around would make their lazy Sunday afternoon stroll in the park feel more like a day at the shooting range, there were widespread protests. Much like it did at the nose cone of a Concorde about to go supersonic, pressure began to mount, and soon enough countries chose to close their airspace to supersonic travel. Concorde could still fly at subsonic speeds over land and supersonic speeds over the ocean, but the overland speed restrictions severely limited the potential routes it could fly faster than a regular plane. On the back of all the hype, Concorde had taken over 100 orders through the 1960s. But as the extent to supersonic travel bans became clear, those orders were cancelled at an alarming rate until only 2 airlines remained: Air France and British Airways. And since they were the national airlines of the 2 countries behind the entire Concorde project, it's safe to assume they didn't have much choice in the matter. In the end, just 14 Concordes made it into service. 7 for Air France and 7 for BA. What was supposed to have been an exciting new dawn for air travel was now beginning to unravel. It's widely believed that Concorde was never profitable, but that isn't actually true. Concorde did indeed run at a loss for several years after its launch in 1976. At one point, things got so bad the entire fleet was almost scrapped. But then some clever economist at BA came up with a radical idea for how to make more money. They quadrupled their ticket prices. By the late 1990s, a return flight from London to New York on Concorde was about 30 times more expensive than the cheapest alternative, and twice the cost of flying first class on a subsonic plane. But those who could afford it didn't care. Concorde was, quite simply, the most glamorous way to get around. Buy yourself a ticket, and there was every chance you'd end up sitting next to a politician, a prominent CEO, a Hollywood celebrity, or a really hard-working drug dealer. For a few decades during the 80s and 90s, anyone who was anyone was flying Concorde. Multiple heads of state, at least one pope, Queen Elizabeth II, and even the Olympic torch were all proud members of the 11 Miles High Club. By the mid-80s, Concorde's unique brand of flight-based FOMO allowed both Air France and BA to turn a solid profit, and Concorde continued to be a supersonic success for most of the following 2 decades. But, sadly, the good times were about to reach an abrupt end. On the 25th of July, in the year 2000, Air France Flight 4590 took off from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris on its way to JFK International in New York. The trip was about 3,625 miles all told, but it only managed 5 before crashing into a hotel in a Parisian suburb. Both hotel and plane were utterly obliterated, and all 109 people on board were killed, along with 5 on the ground. Passenger plane crashes are rare, so they tend to make the headlines, but when the most prominent plane on the planet plummeted to the earth, it was a global sensation. The entire Concorde fleet, well, all 14 planes, were grounded whilst an investigation was carried out into the cause of this crash. In the end, it was found that a strip of metal that had fallen off a different aircraft had punctured one of Concorde's tyres during takeoff, which in turn caused a big chunk of debris to smash into the underside of one of its wings. The impact caused a fuel leak, the fuel ignited, and power to the left-hand engines was lost, ultimately bringing the plane down. It's a quirk of statistics that, by some measures, that one single crash turned Concorde from the safest plane in the world to the most dangerous overnight. Before the year 2000, Concorde had flown for more than 3 decades without a single fatal accident. Until now. But the crash wasn't curtains for Concorde. Safety improvements were made to the wheels and fuel tanks, and they were soon back in the sky. To give you an idea of just how famous Concorde was by this point, the first post-accident test flights were aired live on TV, and crowds gathered at both the origin and destination airports. On September the 11th, 2001, a modified BA Concorde completed its first test flight with a full complement of passengers on board. Yep, it was that September 11th. The crucial test flight landed just hours before the World Trade Center terrorist attacks. The 2 events were obviously unrelated, but the combined effect of the high-profile crash and the sharp drop in demand for international travel after 9/11 saw Concorde's passenger numbers nosedive. Of course, it was a rough time for the airline industry in general, not just Concorde, and perhaps they might have been able to weather the storm had things gone a little differently. But behind closed doors, the final nail was about to be hammered into the Concorde coffin. Bear in mind, by this point, Concorde was more than 30 years old. It sported an entirely analog cockpit and relied on a whole host of very complex, very out-of-date systems. It was so complicated that it required an extra crew member to fly, a dedicated flight engineer. a role that modern aircraft at the time had long since done away with. In 2003, Airbus, who by that time had acquired Aerospatiale, the French company that originally manufactured Concorde alongside the British Aircraft Corporation, revealed that they would no longer be making replacement parts for this ancient aircraft. In other words, if Concorde was going to stay in the air, it would need to be rebuilt from the inside out. With passenger numbers falling in the wake of the double whammy of the famous crash and the World Trade Center attacks, it was an easy decision to retire the service altogether. In 2003, that's exactly what happened. Okay, so that explains why Concorde died. But why have no other supersonic planes ever come to take its place? First of all, whilst technology has come a long way in the 20-odd years since Concorde was retired, physics has proven to be stubbornly unwilling to change. Sonic booms have refused to stop sonically booming, and whilst the likes of NASA and Lockheed Martin are in the process of testing supersonic aircraft capable of dampening the effect, there's no way to eliminate the noise entirely. For that reason, overland commercial supersonic travel is still banned in most countries, which continues to limit possible routes, and therefore the commercial incentive just isn't there. And there's another problem. As a plane's speed increases, so too does drag. That's actually why we started calling it the sound barrier in the first place. When pilots first had access to jet-propelled aircraft, around the time of the Second World War, they experienced such a dramatic increase in aerodynamic drag at high speeds that it seemed as though they were reaching some kind of genuine speed barrier that couldn't be crossed. Chuck Yeager proved that to be false on the 14th of October 1947, when he broke the sound barrier in the cockpit of the Bell X-1.
Through the sound barrier, the first time ever in level flight.
But the effect of drag at high speed still poses a problem, even today. Amongst other things, it makes flying at supersonic speeds seriously inefficient, which would naturally inflate ticket prices. And in an industry that accounts for 2.5% of global CO2 emissions, it's an environmental concern too. Less efficiency equals more fuel burn per passenger mile. And here's a question for you. Is supersonic flight even worth it? Concorde operated in a time before humanity was ruled over by the omnipotent overlord that calls itself the Internet. If you were a fat cat businessman in the 1980s, crossing the Atlantic in 3 hours instead of 8 meant less time disconnected from the real world. Close a multi-million-dollar deal or two in the time you saved by flying Concorde, and the ticket paid for itself. But thanks to the internet, these days that same fat cat can cross the Atlantic in the lavishly luxurious first-class cabin of a regular aircraft, without ever disconnecting from his virtual office. Concorde was never particularly fancy on the inside because there simply wasn't the space. The need for a hyper-streamlined profile kept the internal dimensions firmly on the tiny side. Now, admittedly, I don't know many fat cat businessmen, but I'm guessing plenty would rather spend 8 hours feeling like God himself in Emirates first class than 3 feeling like a slightly squashed Sonic on Concorde. Despite everything I've said, there are still plans afoot to bring supersonic flight back from the dead. Several different companies are working on overcoming the many issues associated with it, with boom technology perhaps the most promising. Call me old-fashioned, but to my mind it's a bit odd to name your product after its biggest drawback. American Airlines recently put down a deposit of 20 of Boom's planned Overture supersonic aircraft. But as for whether or not that will actually come to anything, only time will tell. As of today, a hyper-expensive, sonic-booming, jet-fuel-guzzling supersonic jet whose ticket prices can only be afforded by the world's richest people sounds like a distant and unlikely dream. Then again, that's what they said about Concorde. Thanks for watching. Once again, remember to play War Thunder now on PC, PlayStation or Xbox using my link in the description. By clicking my unique link and registering, you'll get a large free bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles, premium account, boosters and much more, so don't miss out.